Greetings and welcome to ValoU. I'm Zaladrith and I'll be your instructor for today. Today's class is Tactics 200, Game Sense and the Fog. From how people talk about it, one would think that Game Sense is some magical, intangible skill that some people are blessed with and others aren't, that just lets you make coin flip guesses on enemy locations with supernatural accuracy so that every decision is optimized. The reality is far simpler when you break it down, and for this class I'd like to describe one specific analogy that might help at least explain the part that predicts enemy locations. Imagine a fog or mist that is released from the enemy's base gates as soon as the round starts. If you or an ally would ever see this fog or mist, then it's eradicated in that area or held at bay. However, it's a little different than typical fog of war because as soon as you stop looking, it doesn't immediately reclaim all that space. Instead, it spreads out at the same speed that an enemy can run at, or if you have a teammate in audio range, then at the speed an enemy can walk at. At this point, you may have accurately guessed that the fog simply represents all possible locations that enemies can be. For instance, if there is a Neon or a Yoru on the enemy team, the fog can move faster or appear in otherwise impossible locations, but for simplicity let's ignore the effects of agent utility on the fog for now. While not a hard rule, if it's ever possible for the fog to reach your back, then you're probably in big trouble. The most common way this happens is when a loud attacker push gets stopped up by utility in front of a site, for long enough that defenders can flank. The purpose of a flank watcher is to prevent this fog from creeping up behind you. At least you can die facing the enemy instead of being shot in the back. While it's dangerous to peek, it's often more dangerous to not peek, since that allows the fog to creep up all the way from behind. In this example, as long as you alternate between peeking on both sides of sewer on fracture, it's impossible for the fog to ever reach your back, since the walking speed at which the fog can move silently is too slow to reach you before getting eliminated by your next peek, so you'll always have a fair face-to-face fight. So in order to help prevent the spread of the fog, one strategy you can employ is spreading out and watching every entrance to your side of the map, not letting any fog through, which is commonly what the defender team does. If you group up as 5 after all, the fog can spread faster on the other side of the map, and eventually take over the other site and more. However, spreading your team too thin can be problematic as well, because the fog also has some other properties, density and the ability to fight back. The imaginary fog is denser to represent the possibility of more enemies, representing more danger. This is especially scary for defenders because the fog is 5 enemies thick at every point from the base gates as soon as the round starts, a situation that only gets worse as the round goes on without hearing any noise. However, every time that you see or hear an actual enemy somewhere else on the map, it removes the possibility of that enemy being in the fog, making the fog on the rest of the entire map thinner until enough time has passed for that player to rotate there. This is what makes info on enemies so important. Hearing a few sets of footsteps can completely change the way your team plays, as you adjust to account for the new fog density in all areas of the map. So now that we know about fog density, let's simplify and assume we're just talking about a specific individual player's fog. Each individual player emanates their own fog from their last known location until they get spotted or heard again, which is why specific agent callouts are so important. The worse a player is, the more likely it is that they're at the center of their fog as they get too scared to move, and the more likely they are to get surrounded and multi-peeked. The better a player is, the more likely it is that they're playing to the limits of their extreme edge of the fog, which often surprises those not used to the bold, chaotic movement and seemingly nonsensical positional and directional changes of an experienced player. This also forces enemies to respect the larger surface area of the fog, putting greater pressure on that team as respecting that someone can be anywhere stretches everyone thinner. In this next clip, I once again demonstrate what it's like to play at the edges of your fog, being at or close to the border of where it's possible for you to be on the map, to create pressure and then punish enemies that don't respect the fog. At first, my fog is restricted to B main when I'm spotted out by Raze and forced back by a grenade. Now Omen is a great lurker because my teleport here has 3 rational destinations. 1 is further back in garage to avoid the grenade and leave, 2 is to the right behind the double box, and 3 is across to the pillar, which is the one that I take. This creates 3 separate patches of fog, and as I hear Raze drop down from heaven to get in front of my smoke, the patches of fog from all 3 locations are now triple swinging her. Fog 1 in garage has had enough time to shift walk up to the corner after the grenade and swing. Fog 2 behind double box can swing at any time, and Fog 3, which is me, also has time to shift walk out on site, which she appears not to respect, since she chooses to watch 2 out of the 3 patches of fog. Also, she might not respect how fast I dare to move as I immediately silent walk forward instead of holding an angle. After punishing her bad guess, I'm allowed to make noise since my location was made known from my gunfire. So I knife run for a step or 2 because it's unlikely for a second enemy to have made no noise while their Raze was being pressured on site. I'm a little lax, not waiting for my gun to fully come out as I'm swinging spawn, but I am trying to maximize playing to the edge of my fog, while balancing risk by at least having my gun ready for most of it. At this point, I want to respect the enemy fog coming from both heaven and spawn. If I just wait on sight, I can get surrounded or double swung by the fog, creeping forward from both sides. So, rather than being forced back, I decide that pushing is lower risk and higher reward. It's low risk because my spike is honestly closer to the other side anyway, plus my team is taking so much pressure in mid that I need to help take on additional pressure as well. It's high reward because as long as I win my duel in spawn, any players in heaven have to respect my fog, either leaving heaven to try to push me out, helping out my team, or they have to push forward to fight my teammates in fear of getting flanked by me, which loses them their defender's advantage. In short, they can no longer wait comfortably as my team's fog would surround them on both sides. Luckily, there was no one in their spawn, so my fog is just allowed to engulf them. Since my location is once again given away by my gunfire, I once again push the limits of my fog by running a few steps before going silent and deciding that it's still low risk, high reward to keep pushing. My entire team was running to B through sewer and mid and killing off the Astra's team, so the Astra should have been rotating off from A long ago. I knew her team assumed their spawn was safe because they were happy just waiting there to die in heaven. Thus, if she was going to rotate through spawn, she would already have been running either a gun or a knife out to either help cover their flank or just fast rotate, since she would assume the space behind her team's lines are safe. Since I didn't see her or hear her on the way up the stairs, I assumed that she took a path rope or sewers, or even the long flank through my team's spawn. I decided to shift walk instead of gun run, since if she took the ropes path I would still be in audio range, and since her fog has only spread to mid by now, I smoke off mid to make B heaven easier to hold, helping to stall her as long as possible. If she had gone through our spawn, then if she walked she'd either be incredibly late, and my next smoke would be ready, or if she was full running then my jet would hear her. For some reason though, my jet decides to waste my smoke and push, but that does give me a glimpse of the enemy's location. Since it's outside my audio range, I quickly knife run to try to keep as close to the edge of my fog as I can. Once in audio range, I knife walk as far as I dare, knowing that from her point of view, Skye was last heard planting, and I was last seen Heaven's Stair killing her teammates. Those are the two perceived centers of our team's fog, and it can only have spread so far, right? So now, since you can only move at gunwalk speed, I quickly catch up, choosing to carefully line up my shot and waiting for when she is stationary to easily finish off the round with 4 successful flank kills. So in this clip, I made educated guesses based on the enemy's fog, played to the edges of my fog, and protected myself from the possibility of getting surrounded or flanked by advancing in relatively less protected areas of the map. Bringing this back up to a team level, the fog usually matters the most towards the end of a round, when the fog has had the most time to spread and more information is available. If you find yourself or your team being pressured by fog from the flanks, rather than worrying about staying in one place and trying to protect yourself from the fog from all angles, it's often better to take the offensive and clear a path either forwards or backwards to make some space. After all, the fog can only follow you at walking speed without making noise, so as long as you keep pushing in a direction and taking new space, it's impossible for the fog to catch up to you. Also, while avoiding enemies is one way to deal with the fog, the best way is to eliminate enemies, as that simplifies enemy fog on the map, as well as meaning less enemies to detect your team members' fog. As you clear out the fog in new areas, however, you have to remember to check all corners for pockets of unchecked fog, keeping in mind that these pockets can still grow and expand at walking speed even if you're nearby. For instance, when clearing Ascent B site, the enemy team critically misses the sound cue where I drop onto site, and because of that, there's probably actually no possible place on the map where my fog could even exist without making sound. Since pockets of fog can move and expand, I managed to avoid detection by staying in my fog to surprise the enemies and stop the diffuser as my Brimstone misclicks his ult. So in summary, the part of game sense that we discussed today is predicting enemy locations. We use the analogy of a fog or mist that covers the map that indicates all possible locations for enemies. Looking at the fog will keep it at bay, ensuring that no enemies could have crossed. This fog can be thicker or thinner depending on the number of enemies that are possible to be in an area, and seeing or hearing enemies resets the fog back to the individual enemy's location. Good players tend to be able to play toward the limits of their fog, whereas less experienced players will tend to stay towards the center of their fog and thus be more predictable. It's usually a good idea to push through thinner fog areas in order to prevent your team from getting surrounded. Keep in mind that pockets of fog can move and grow, so be sure to completely clear areas and don't leave any unchecked pockets. That's all for today's lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the lecturer or the TAs in the comments below. Thanks for attending, and we hope you enjoy your stay here at ValoU.